Okay, thank you all for coming. This is almost the end. My name is Bidanda. I am a finance PhD student, and I'm going to give you a glimpse of my job market paper today, which is called The Small Employers as Origins of Entrepreneurship. So I'm going to be using some data from the US Census Bureau. I've gone through the proper disclosures so I can share it with you today. So first, let me talk about why it's important and interesting to learn about entrepreneurs. Entrepreneurship is very important in the US economy and all economies really, for job growth, for innovation, as well as for local economies in the US. Now, what's happened, though, is that in the past few decades, since 1980, we've seen a decline in new firms in the US. And so the importance of entrepreneurship is therefore we're losing out on it in the US economy in these last 4 decades. And so therefore it's really important to understand what are the origins of entrepreneurship and where are the entrepreneurs coming from in the US economy, because understanding where they come from can maybe allow us to understand this trend a bit more. And so now there has been some literature, or much literature, on the origins of entrepreneurship, as well as some explanations for why this trend is going down. But one understudied aspect of this is the employers, or the past work experience of entrepreneurs before they start their new firm. And now this is particularly important in this recent trend of the past few decades, because while this decline in entrepreneurship has been happening, we've also been seeing a changing landscape of employers. We've seen the rise of superstar firms, as well as the rise of firm concentration in the US in terms of labor market power, as well as market power in general. Now, it's not really clear, though, ex ante, which employers might contribute to better and more entrepreneurs in the US economy. So on the one hand side, it could be that entrepreneurs come from small employers. So maybe I want to become an entrepreneur, so I'm going to go work at a 5-person new firm, and I'm going to be able to observe everything that's happening in the firm. I'm able to observe the decisions they're making, as well as all the different departments that are happening. I'm also able to interact with the management more, so I can more likely to talk to the CEO or the CFO than if I were in a very big company. So maybe I'm learning when I'm at my small employer. This could also just be a preference story. It could be that if I have a preference for entrepreneurship, then I also have a preference for working at a small employer. And so it could just be a sorting story. It could be a learning story. And then on the flip side, it could be that coming from a large employer is actually more beneficial for entrepreneurship. Large employers have bigger R&D budgets, and so maybe the spillovers from these can make someone have better human capital, which makes them more able to perform better in any next job that they do. Or it could even be that these spillovers from R&D, I can take one of those spillovers or a discarded idea from my employer, and I can use that idea to start my own firm. A second component of coming from a large employer that might be beneficial is that large employers tend to give you higher wages. And so maybe these higher wages can contribute to your income and allow you can alleviate the financial constraints of starting a new firm. So if I need some starting capital to start my firm, having higher wages in the past make me more likely to be able to get that capital. So my research question today is going to marry these two ideas together, and I'm going to look at who are the employers of successful entrepreneurs. And so obviously this is challenging for many reasons, but the main challenge is the lack of data. So for one, there are very few entrepreneurs in the US economy, and so therefore you need a large representative sample to be able to get enough observations. Second, using that data, we need to be able to track these people over time. So we can't just get one cross-section or one snapshot. We need to be able to observe their past work history, as well as the success of the new firm that they start. So we need longitudinal data. So what I do in my job market paper is I use a combination of data sets from the US Census. And this is beneficial for many reasons. First, because of the sample, I can observe the full universe of all new firms in the US. Second, it's longitudinal, so I can observe the founders as well as these firms over time. Third, because of this size, because I can observe everybody, I can estimate heterogeneity, both of the past employers as well as the new firms that are being started. And then lastly, this data set allows me to have a lot of detail. And so one key thing I'm going to do is I'm going to differentiate the different types of entrepreneurs. I just motivated why we study entrepreneurship because they create jobs. And so therefore, in my study, I'm going to focus on job-creating entrepreneurs, which my data set allows me to do. So now let me quickly walk you through my main findings of the paper. We definitely won't get time to go over them in a lot of detail, so let me just walk you through them all. So the first one, I find that within industry, entrepreneurs tend to come from smaller employers. So what I find is that workers from small employers are 3 times more likely to become entrepreneurs than workers from larger employers. And I find that this is conditional on a lot of traits of the employer as well as the worker themselves. My second main fact looks at the success of the new firms that are founded. So conditional on becoming a founder, founders from small successful employers are 25% more likely to become successful than founders from small unsuccessful employers. And I'm measuring success in terms of the relative growth as well as survival of the new firm that's being started. And so what I'm going to say in the last part of my paper, which I don't have too much time to go over, is that these 2 facts I'm going to say are consistent with an idea of learning at small employers. The idea being I have a preference for entrepreneurship, so I'm going to seek out small employers to potentially gain skills and gain learning from them. And then if I go to that small employer and they're successful, that means that they have efficient and useful processes in place. And so I'm going to emulate that in my new firm that I start. In addition, I'm also going to say that the longer that I spend at my past employer, the more likely I am to be successful in the future. And so this is consistent with an idea of the longer I've been there, the more time I have to accumulate the skills that would make me successful in the future. Great, so I'm going to quickly go over the data and how I construct my data set. So my main analysis is going to use the cross-section of all US workers in 2005. So I'm going to start with the cross-section of all the total economy, essentially, of workers. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to look at those workers. I'm going to see which of them become founders in the following 5 years. And that will be my first outcome variable of interest. On top of that, I'm also going to look at those founders, the success of their new firm for the following 10 years. And then going back to my sample of all workers in 2005, I'm going to look at their work history in the past 10 years, as well as their employer's history in the past 25 years. So that's just a little overview of my data set to give you a sense of the outcome variables that I'm thinking about. So now in the time that I have remaining, I'm going to go through 3 main facts from my paper. I have many more. Please read my paper. You can learn more about them. But starting with my first fact, using that sample of all workers in 2005, I'm going to look at which ones are likely to become entrepreneurs in the following 5 years. So my x-axis is going to be the employer size. So everyone has an employer in 2005, and I'm going to look at what their employer's size is. And the y-axis is going to be the likelihood that that worker becomes an entrepreneur. And so as you can see, if you come from a smaller employer, you're much more likely to become an entrepreneur than if you came from a large employer. And this magnitude is really big. I mentioned at the beginning, you're 3 times more likely, which is very huge. The second fact that I'll go over quickly is about the success of the founder. So first, let me quickly define what I'm going to call success. I'm going to say that a founder has created a successful new firm if the new firm is in the top 10th percentile of employment compared to other firms who started in the same start year and industry as that firm. And this industry is a very narrow industry as well. And so what I also say about this is that I'm going to make this measure 0 if the firm did not survive to the year I'm looking at. So for example, if I consider your success in year 5, if you didn't make it to year 5, then you're not successful. So this is essentially a measure of both relative growth as well as survival of the firm. And so I'm going to show you the same x-axis that I showed you before, which is the employer's log employment. And now I'm going to switch the y-axis to be the likelihood that you start a successful new firm. I'm also going to break it out by the success of your past employer. So essentially, the red dots are going to be founders who came from successful employers, and the green dots are going to be founders that came from unsuccessful employers. So essentially, if you came from a small, successful employer, you're much more likely to be a successful founder. And if you came from an unsuccessful employer, you're less likely. Now, I'll just show you the mid-size and large, but I don't have too much time to go over it, and there's not much meaningful results there. or information there. And so then in the last part of my paper, what I say is that this is consistent with an idea of learning at small employers. So the idea is first that I briefly told you before, you're learning by observing at your past employer. And so this relates to the first fact of entry into entrepreneurship in a selection mechanism. I'm thinking it through selection. So a worker is going to have a preference for entrepreneurship, so they're going to seek out a place to learn entrepreneurial skills. So that's the entry margin. Now the success margin is once they get to that small employer, maybe this employer is successful, and so they gain successful skills, or they learn how to be a successful new firm, and then they go and emulate that later. Or if they come from an unsuccessful firm, they don't really gain many skills because they don't know how to be a successful new firm. And so I'm going to consider this hypothesis of learning versus the alternative hypothesis that this is only selection. So in this story I just told you, there is a bit of selection in there. I'm definitely not saying that there's no selection, but I'm considering this versus the alternative hypothesis that there's absolutely only selection and there's no learning that's happening. And so one test, I have many tests, but one test that I'm going to tell you about today is I'm going to think about the tenure of the worker. And I'm going to think about their tenure as a length of treatment variable. The idea being, the longer that I was at my past employer, the longer I had to accumulate skills. And so now, versus the alternative hypothesis of only selection, if there were only selection that were happening, then regardless of how much time I was at my employer, I'm just as likely to be successful. So if all of the smartest people went to the small, successful employer, and then some stayed for 5 years, some stayed for 3 years, and they're just as likely to be successful, I'm going to say that that's only selection that's happening. And so what I find is, so the left-hand side is founders from small employers, and then the right-hand side is founder from mid-sized employers, and the x-axis is their tenure, so the number of years that they were at that firm. And what you find is that the longer they were there, the more likely they are to be successful. And then meaningfully, when you compare this to founders from large employers, what we find actually is that their tenure doesn't matter. So no matter how long you're at your large employer, you're the same likelihood of being successful. And so just to conclude, I find that workers from small employers are more likely to be successful, and that successful employers predict higher likelihood of success. And then lastly, this is consistent with an idea of learning at small employers. And with that, I'll conclude. Thank you.